Good evening, everybody. We're gonna go ahead and get started. Looks like we have just a few folks with us tonight, but it is being recorded. So for those people who can't join us, we will post this on our website, msga.org. And same for you all. You all can go back and watch this if you did have any questions. But I'm Elisa Hermes. I'm our Director of Rules and Competitions here at the Maryland State Golf Association. Want to thank you all for joining us tonight and for being members of the MSGA. So we are going to cover rules 7 and 9 this evening. This is part 4 of our five-part series for our virtual rules. So we are going to go ahead and get started. So our goals tonight, we're going to be able to determine what is a fair search, and we're also going to be learning how to identify the ball once found. We're going to learn what happens if it moves. Maybe did wind, water, or gravity cause the ball to move? What happens if I move the ball? And what happens if someone else or something else moves the ball? So we will be able to answer those questions as we run through this evening. Just a few reminders if you've joined us in the previous sessions. A word in italics means it is a definition, and as always, definitions are the building blocks of the rules. If you maybe don't understand the rule or need clarification, it's always good to go and look in the definition part of the book or on the website, and that can provide a little more clarity into what the rules are trying to accomplish. The general penalty, as always, is 2 strokes in stroke play and loss of hole in match play. And the rules like to direct us to other rules. This is mainly to help cut down on repetition. So if we see it referencing Rule 14.2, it's going to give us the procedure as to how to do something with the ball rather than write that all out within that one rule. So in Rule 7, we're going to cover what you're allowed to do to find your ball on the course, which is going to be known as fairly searching. And when you aren't sure a ball you have found is yours, we're also going to cover what you do if your ball moves while you are looking for it or identifying it. So again, the purpose of this rule is that it allows the player to take reasonable actions to fairly search for their ball in play after each stroke. But the player must still be careful, as a penalty will apply if the player acts excessively and causes improvement to the conditions affecting their next stroke, which was something we covered in Rule 8. And if you were not here with us last session, you can definitely watch that presentation on our website. So another thing we'll talk about later in Rule 9 is that the player gets no penalty if the ball is accidentally moved in trying to find or identify it, but we then must replace the ball on its original spot. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in Rule 9. So how to fairly search for our ball. Again, this is a bit of a common sense thought, but a player may take reasonable actions to find and identify their ball, and a player is responsible for finding their ball in play after each stroke. Again, if you are playing in a tournament or as we see these players and caddies and spectators, you can always get help in trying to find your ball, but the player is ultimately responsible for finding their ball in play and playing it. So the player may fairly search for the ball. And this internal definition, so when we see internal definitions, it means it's not officially a definition within the back of the rules, but it's going to give us a little more insight as to what the rules think this concept of fairly search means. So the player may fairly search for the ball by taking reasonable actions to find and identify it, such as maybe moving sand and water, or maybe moving or bending grass, bushes, tree branches, or maybe something other that might be growing or attached and is a natural object. Also, breaking objects, but only if such breaking is the result of other reasonable actions taken to find or identify the ball. So breaking, comes with a proviso that it must be the result of a reasonable action. So you can't just go around in this area just breaking a bunch of objects because you think that you can and you're fairly searching. It has to actually be a reasonable action that you're taking to find your golf ball. So if taking such reasonable actions as part of a fair search improves the conditions affecting the stroke, we're not going to get a penalty under Rule 8.1a if the improvement results from a fair search. However, if the improvement results from actions that exceeded what was reasonable for a fair search, the player gets the general penalty for breach of this rule. So an example of actions unlikely to be part of a fair search, you're maybe flattening an area of tall grass beyond what is reasonably necessary to look for a ball in a place where you think it might be, or removing something growing from the ground or breaking a tree branch to get to a ball when it could have easily been reached without doing those things. So that's kind of an example or a couple of examples that the rules see as unlikely to be part of a fair search. So in trying to find and identify the ball, the player may remove loose impediments as allowed in Rule 15.1. Again, that's pointing us over to our loose impediment rule. But you do want to be careful when moving those loose impediments, because if you move them and there may be you may be at risk for a penalty of 1 stroke. But, if you're just trying to search and you're brushing through the grass and brushing through leaves, then that's going to be allowed. But if you have found your ball and you are moving these loose impediments, you do want to use a bit of caution there. You can remove movable obstructions. So totally fine to, move some penalty area stakes or move a bench or, what have you. You are able to do that. So here we're going to see what to do if sand affecting the lie of the player's ball is moved while trying to find or identify it. Here we're going to need to recreate the original lie in the sand, but you can leave a small part of the ball visible if the ball has been covered by sand. So here we see in this picture, obviously this was a really plugged golf ball within that bunker. Maybe all of a sudden, you're searching for it, and then you find it, but you've removed a lot of that sand that was covering it. You're going to need to recreate that lie. So you're going to need to literally cover back up your golf ball, but you can leave a little bit of that golf ball showing so that you can see where it is. But if you play your golf ball without having recreated the original lie, so if you just play it with it all exposed, you're going to get the general penalty. So again, the rules want us to make sure that we're getting the golf ball back to how it was before we found it. So a player's ball at rest may be identified here in a couple of different ways. We're going to see the 3 ways the rules allow us to identify your golf ball. By the player or anyone else seeing a ball come to rest in circumstances where it is known to be the player's ball. So somebody tees off, maybe they're playing in Arizona here. The ball was driven into the cactus and the player never lost sight of it. Then this condition is going to be met, even if we're not able to see the identifying marks on the ball. So we know it went in there, we saw it the whole way, then that's okay. Our ball has then been identified. Our second way of identifying a golf ball, by seeing the player's identifying mark on the ball, but this does not apply if an identical ball with an identical identifying mark is also found in that same area. We're going to find out a little bit more, get a little bit more clarity about this, maybe when we're playing a provisional golf ball. And we find that and maybe the original golf ball in the same area. We'll learn a little bit more about that here and coming up. But again, if you're out there, the rules say a player should put an identifying mark on the ball to be played. This isn't a must situation, but as always, it's a great idea to at least put some sort of mark on your golf ball when you're out there playing, because you do want to make sure that it indeed is yours before you play it. The third way is going to be by finding a ball with the same brand, model, number, and condition as the player's ball in an area where the player's ball is expected to be. But this does not apply if an identical ball is in the same area and there's no way to know which one is the player's ball. So if there's no way to know, then the ball has not then been identified as the player's. So an example of this would be if you don't mark your golf ball, but maybe you had scuffed it on the previous hole with off of the cart path and you hit it into some tall grass. You're like, I'm playing a Titleist 3. It's a Pro V1X. I know there's a little scuff near the Pro V1X identifying part, and you see it, it's in that same condition, it's in that area where you think it's going to be, there's no other golf balls around there, then of course you have identified your golf ball. So if a player's provisional ball cannot be distinguished from their original ball, we're going to look at Rule 18.3C2. But in case you don't have your books in front of you, in that rule, we learned that if both balls are found, you will choose which one is to be the provisional ball. That ball then is the ball in play, meaning it becomes the provisional ball. You're like, Lisa, I don't really understand what you just said. So I'm going to give you an example here. So if Megan hits her drive towards long grass, she then plays the provisional ball. She's correctly announced that she's playing a provisional ball, and it heads towards that same long grass. When she gets to that area, she finds both balls and cannot tell which is which. So say she hit, again, that Titleist 3 both times. She never marked any of them. Again, it's really important. That's why we want to make sure we mark our golf balls differently. She'll then have to pick one, and that will then be her provisional golf ball. So then she's going to hit 4. So long and short, again, mark your provisional ball differently from your original ball. So lifting our ball to identify it. If a ball might be a player's ball but cannot be identified as it lies, the player may lift the ball to identify it. This also is going to include rotating the ball. However, the spot of the ball must first be marked, and the ball must not be cleaned more than needed to identify it. So, say that there is a huge chunk of mud over the number of the ball where you usually put your mark. You can clean it just a little bit to make sure that it is there, but you can't wipe the entire piece of mud off of your ball. The rules aren't going to let us do that. We want to make sure that we are finding the ball as it's been played. Obviously, there is the exception on the putting green, but again, it's pointing us to Rule 14.1, which is going to call out where we get the procedures for marking, lifting, and cleaning the ball. So this again, marking it is going to apply to all lifting, including rotating the ball. So here we see the player rotating it. They've marked it. That's totally fine. Rotating it is perfectly fine, again, as long as we are marking it. So if the lifted ball is the player's ball or another player's ball, it must be replaced on the original spot. So again, we're getting that call out to Rule 14 where we get those procedures as to how to replace the ball on the original spot. Basically, it's putting it back the way that you found it in relation to the ground, in relation to everything else. So if the player lifts their ball under this rule when not reasonably necessary to identify it, the player gets 1 stroke. So this means you hit your tee shot down the middle of the fairway, you see it land, you know nothing happened to it, you know it wasn't moved, you know a dog didn't pick it up, and then you decide you want to mark, lift, and identify it. We're going to get a one-stroke penalty in that case. So if you see it, you know it's there and it's satisfied one of those three requirements. Again, except on the putting green, we are able to mark, lift, and clean the golf ball. So this exception is just calling out the common sense part of the rules with the process that we're allowed to do. So if the player fails to mark the spot of the ball before lifting it or cleans it when not allowed, they are also going to be on the hook for one penalty stroke. So way back at the beginning of this series, we talked about these multiple breaches and we learned about some golf math. But, say you don't mark it, you pick it up to identify it, you clean it, and it's all kind of happened in one full motion, you're just going to get that one penalty stroke. But if you mark it, or if you don't mark it, you pick it up, somebody says, hey, you're not allowed to do that, and you're also not allowed to clean it, and you go, oh, okay, and then you do clean it anyway, then you're going to be on the hook for multiple penalties. So if you have any questions about that, definitely shoot me an email or give me a call and we can talk through multiple procedural breaches. But if we're doing this all in one full swoop, like I said, you're just going to get that one penalty stroke. So here we see our general penalty statement. Penalty for playing a ball from a wrong place in breach of this rule is going to get us the general penalty. So, if we pick it up, we do everything right. We mark it, lift it, don't clean it, identify it as ours, but we wind up putting it back in the wrong place. In breach of this rule, we are going to get the general penalty in this scenario. So you say, hey, I'm out there, I'm being really careful, but my golf ball was under a bunch of leaves. I accidentally kicked it. This part of the rule is going to cover that scenario. So there's no penalty if the player's ball is accidentally moved by the player, opponent, or anyone else while trying to find or identify it. But if the player causes the ball to move before they start to search for the ball, the player gets one penalty stroke under Rule 9.4b, which we will talk about here in a few minutes. But this is if, their golf ball, they think their golf ball is 250 yards in the rough. They accidentally kick a golf ball that's maybe only 200 yards. That could have been their golf ball. They're not in the area where they think their golf ball might be, so they haven't started to search for that golf ball and they accidentally move it. Unfortunately, we are going to be on the hook for that one penalty stroke. I know it seems a bit unfair, but we want to make sure we're in the area where we think our ball might be before we start to search and then before we identify it. So here we can see in this picture, the player and caddy have not started to search for the ball. So under this rule, accidentally includes when a ball is moved by anyone taking reasonable actions to find the ball, that we're likely to reveal the ball's location by moving it. So maybe if you're sweeping your feet through long grass or shaking a tree, the rules are okay with that if you're accidentally moving your golf ball. So there's not going to be a penalty for doing that. Again, while we're searching and we accidentally move it, that's okay. However, in these situations, this is very important, the ball must be replaced on its original spot. So maybe it is in that tree. You're going to need to get it back to where it was in that tree. And again, if we don't know exactly where it might be, so maybe it was in the rough, you kind of weren't sure, it was really tall, they hadn't mowed because it'd been raining, you're going to need to estimate where that golf ball might be. So if the ball was on, under, or against any immovable obstruction, integral object, boundary object, or growing or attached natural object, it must be replaced. This is like that tree scenario I just talked about, but must be replaced in its original spot, under or against such object. And our second part, if the ball was covered by sand, like we saw earlier, the original lie must be recreated and the ball must be replaced in that lie. So again, it's reminding us of those requirements in Rule 14. And like we saw previously, the player must leave a small part of, or may leave a small part of the ball visible when doing so. I always think when you're looking through the rules, if they're repeating things and you see things multiple times, right? It feels like I've repeated these things a couple of times already tonight. I think that just is showing the importance of that fact within the rule. So always something to just look for, and maybe a little flag might go off in your head like, oh, that's actually important. We need to make sure we follow those procedures. We can also see Rule 15, removal of loose impediments. There is an exception of removing loose impediments where the ball must be replaced. There are going to be some different restrictions that apply, but these are in 15.1. Penalty for breach of this rule. So how can you get this general penalty, you might ask? Maybe you put the ball back in a wrong place. You put the ball back by dropping it into a wrong place. Again, we're going to be replacing it. This means taking your hand, holding the ball, and placing it back down. We're not going to be dropping it in this case. Or maybe you substitute a ball when not permitted. So we're going to have to get the original ball back in that spot. So Rule 7, it has a lot of good information in there. It's a shorter one, but a lot of that information is really important, right? Because we're constantly trying to find and identify our golf ball while we're out there. I'm sure all of you always hit it in the middle of the fairway, but I don't always hit it in the middle of the fairway. So I always, I'm going to need to remember the things in Rule 7 to try to find and identify my golf ball. So just a bit of a recap here. What you're allowed to do, you are allowed to find your ball on the course. Obviously, we're going to want to fairly search, not to go over and beyond to try to find our golf ball. When we're not sure a ball you have found is yours, you can mark, lift, and identify it, hopefully as your ball. Again, we're going to want to be careful not to clean it more than necessary to identify it. If it is your ball, you are going to replace it on the spot from where you picked it up. So again, like I just mentioned, we're going to want to use our hands to replace the ball on that spot. We're not going to use our club just to kind of, flip it back to where it was. That's not seen as replaced in the eyes of the rules. So again, we're just going to remember we're going to want to replace it back. And what to do if your ball moves while you're looking for or identifying it. You'll just need to replace it. And if you don't know exactly where it was moved from, you can just use your best judgment. So hopefully we covered everything there. Again, if you do have any questions while you're running through this, feel free to throw them in the chat. I'll do my best to look through them. But again, this is the basic recap. As long as we're doing these things, we're going to be okay in the eyes of the rules. So Rule 9, ball played as it lies, a ball at rest lifted or moved. So Rule 9 covers what the rules mean by a ball moved. It might not be what you think. The rules used to determine whether a ball moved and what caused a ball to move. The 4 categories of things that can cause a ball to move. What to do and if there are any penalties when a ball is moved by these things. And what to do if there are any penalties if a ball marker is lifted or moved. So here we'll see the purpose of the rule. Again, we always have these central principles that are running through the rules and we like to abide by them. But this central principle of the game, we're going to play the ball as it lies. I am very much for not getting relief from a divot. Among other things, you could get a really bad lie in the fairway, but get a really good lie in the rough, like we see here. So, feel free to disagree with me about divots. It's always a hotly contested topic in my house, but I'm not going to give you relief from a divot because you could have a really good lie elsewhere. So, just part of the game. We're going to play the ball as it lies. So if a player's ball comes to rest and then is moved by natural forces, we will find out what those are. They are wind or water. The player normally must play it from its new spot. So when we talk about the rules and we're studying them here at the MSGA office, there's a little mnemonic trick that I like to use with this one. Natural forces, new spot. Natural forces starts with an N. New starts with an N, obviously. So we're going to remember, oh, natural and new. That's how I like to kind of think of things. Usually that's how we're going to do it. There are a few cases where we return it. But overall, if it's moved by natural forces, you're going to play it from its new spot. So if a ball at rest is lifted or moved by anyone or any outside internal spot. So here I like to think anyone, we see that one for an O. Outside influence starts with an O. We're going to see original spot also starts with an O. I think you can see where I'm going with this. But again, it can help you kind of remember while you're out there. Oh, okay, anyone, I'm going to get it back on its original spot. Players should take care when near any ball at rest, and a player who causes their own ball or an opponent's ball to rest will normally get a penalty. So the rules, they're trying to protect us from things, but we also have to use a bit of caution and common sense when we're out there. We can't just be carelessly walking around and, there may be consequences if you're not taking caution when near another golf ball, right? We can't just be out there and it just be chaos. So the rules are going to guide us through, how we can take caution and make sure we don't get a penalty. And again, we see this lovely exception, obviously, on the putting green. There's going to be some special allowances. There's going to be the allowance of accidental movement on the putting green. We're not going to get a penalty for that, but otherwise, we're just talking, general area, bunkers, penalty areas, those sorts of things. So playing a ball from where it came to rest, a player's ball at rest on the course must be played as it lies, except when the rules require or allow the player to play a ball from another place on the course. Here in the picture, we see a player taking relief from a penalty area. They're not going to play it where it came to rest. That's okay, as long as they're playing it from the correct relief area. To lift a ball and then replace it on its original spot. This is another exception. Here, the player's replacing the ball after it had been moved from its original spot. So what to do when a ball moves during a backswing? Sorry about that. This probably has happened to, everybody, but it does rarely happen. But we'll learn what to do when it does move. So moved, like I mentioned, might not be what you think. So in the eyes of the rules, a ball that is moved is considered when a ball at rest has left its original spot and has come to rest on any other spot, and this can be seen by the naked eye. So I'm going to show this slide one more time. Here you can see that ball moved. Here you can see that ball maybe went away, but then came back. So really, it moved, but not in the eyes of the rules. It came back to its original spot. So this applies whether the ball has gone up, down, or horizontally in any direction away from its original spot. So there we saw the ball move to the side. Maybe it was sitting up on some tall grass, like on a clump of grass, and then it moved down, it sunk down, that means that it moved, down. So ball has also been considered moved. So if a ball at rest only wobbles, sometimes you might hear the word oscillating, or just kind of like jiggles around. But it stays on and returns to its original spot. This means the ball has not moved. So here we get back to what to do when the ball moves during a backswing or stroke. If a player's ball at rest begins moving after the player has begun the stroke or the backswing for a stroke, and the player goes on to make that stroke. So there we can see it moves, but then he completes the putt. The ball must not be replaced no matter what caused it to move. Instead, the player must play the ball from where it comes to rest after the stroke. If the player caused the ball to move, we're going to look, we'll find out here in a few minutes, but we're going to look at Rule 9.4b to find out if there is a penalty. So a penalty for playing a ball from a wrong place in breach of this rule, we're going to get the general penalty. Okay, so we definitely know our ball moved. We're going to decide whether it has moved. A player's ball at rest is treated as having moved only if it is known or virtually certain that it did. Known or virtually certain. In the rules circles, it could be known as KVC. We like to abbreviate some things. So KVC means it is the standard for deciding what happened to a player's ball. Maybe, for example, whether the ball came to rest in a penalty area, whether it moved, or what caused it to move. So known or virtually certain means more than just possible or probable. It means either there's conclusive evidence that the event in question happened to the player's ball, maybe a player or witness saw it happen, or although there's a very small degree of doubt, all reasonably available information shows that it is at least 95% likely that the event in question happened. So if you're out there and you're like, yeah, I don't know, maybe, and there's still quite a bit of doubt in your mind, then we're not going to be able to apply this known or virtually certain standard. But all reasonably available information includes all information the player knows and all information they can get with reasonable effort and without unreasonable delay. So when searching for a ball, only information discovered within the 3-minute search time is considered when determining whether knowledge or virtual certainty exists. All right, so now we know what that means. You can tell your friends, yeah, I have knowledge or virtual certainty. I'm 95% sure that this happened. So if the ball might have moved, but is not known or virtually certain, it is treated as not having moved and must be played as it lies. So if you're, it's a windy day out there and you think, I don't know, maybe it moved, but I'm not sure, then we're just going to go ahead and play it as it lies. So an example of when it's known or virtually certain a ball is moved. Here's a great example. A player marks, lifts, and replaces their ball on the putting green. As the player walks away, the ball rolls a short distance and comes to rest. The player does not see this, but another player observes the ball moving and informs the player. Since it is known that the ball moved, the player must replace the ball on its original spot. So an example of when it is not known or virtually certain, player A and B play their approach shots to the putting green. They could not see the two balls come to rest. Unknown to the players, player B's ball struck player A's ball at rest, and it rolled some distance farther from the hole. So it kind of stinks, but as long as this information does not come to the attention of the players before A makes the next stroke, A does not get a penalty from playing from where their ball came to rest after being struck by player B's ball. So these are just two different examples of when and when we do have knowledge of virtual certainty and when we do not have knowledge of virtual certainty. So deciding what caused the ball to move. When a player's ball at rest has moved, it must be decided what caused it to move. This determines whether the player must replace the ball or play it as it lies and whether there is a penalty. We are going to have 4 possible causes for a ball at rest that moves before the player makes a stroke. There's not 3, there's not 5, there's not 10, there's only 4 within the eyes of the rules. Natural forces, such as wind or water, maybe the player's actions, maybe their caddy, maybe their partner, maybe their partner's caddy, the opponent's actions in match play, including the actions of the opponent's caddy, maybe their partner, or maybe their partner's caddy, or an outside influence, including any other player in stroke play. So what are natural forces? These are the effects of nature, such as wind, water, or when something happens for no apparent reason because of the effects of gravity. So you have no idea why this ball moved. There's really no other explanation. We're going to chalk it up to natural forces. So this known or virtually certain standard for deciding what caused the ball to move, the player, the opponent, or an outside influence is treated as having caused the ball to move only if it is known or virtually certain to be the cause. So the player, the opponent, outside influence. If it is known or virtually certain that at least one of these was the cause, the ball is treated, or if it is not known or virtually certain that one of those 3 caused the ball to move, the ball is treated as having been moved by natural forces. So again, like I said, if there's really no other explanation as to why the ball moved, then that's okay. So in applying this standard, all reasonably available information must be considered, which means all information the player knows or can get with reasonable effort without unreasonably delaying play. So a ball moved by natural forces. If natural forces causes a player's ball to move, ball at rest to move, there is no penalty and the ball must be played from its new spot. So there we saw that ball move from its spot. Just got to play it from its new spot. There are some exceptions, however, these are going to be called out. So a ball in the putting green must be replaced if it moves after having already been lifted and replaced. So in this case, the ball owns that spot once you've marked, lifted, and replaced it. So if the player's ball on the putting green moves after we do those, the ball must be replaced on its original spot. If we don't know for sure, we're going to estimate, but we likely will know because we actually marked it and lifted and replaced it. And this is true no matter what caused it to move. So it's a really windy day. You rush up there because your ball is only 5 feet from the hole. You mark it, you lift it, and the wind just does not die down. It actually gets worse. You replace the golf ball. So, and then you pick up, you pick up your marker and it blows it now down this hill 10, and now you're 20 feet from the hole. You're going to need to replace your golf ball where it was 5 feet from the hole. So doesn't matter if it was wind, doesn't matter if it was a bird, we're still going to want to put it back there. So a ball at rest must be replaced if it moves to another area of the course or out of bounds after being dropped, placed, or replaced. This is sort of known as that Ricky Fowler rule out of the waste management a few years ago. But if the player puts the original ball or another ball into play by dropping, placing, or replacing it, and natural forces cause the ball at rest to move and come to rest in another area of the course or out of bounds, the ball must be replaced on its original spot. So here he dropped his ball, it came to rest, and then sometime later, while he's not even near it, it rolled into that penalty area. We're now going to be able, and unfortunately at that time, he was not able. This exception was not around, so I believe he was not, he did have that penalty, but now you're fine. You just want to get it back to that spot. Again, for a ball on the putting green that was replaced, we're going to revert back to exception 1. So penalty for playing a ball from a wrong place in breach of this rule. So you never replace your golf ball and it was moved, maybe. You're playing it from a wrong place. You're going to get the general penalty. So when a ball is lifted or moved by a player. So we're going to need to figure out replacing it and if we get a penalty. So this rule applies only when it is known or virtually certain a player, including the player's caddy, lifted their ball at rest, or the player's or their caddy's action caused it to move. If the player lifts their ball at rest or causes it to move, the ball must be replaced on its original spot. Except when the player lifts the ball under a rule to take relief or to replace the ball on a different spot, so maybe you're taking relief from a cart path, that's okay. Or when the ball moves only after the player has begun the stroke or the backswing for a stroke and then goes on to make the stroke like we saw earlier at the beginning of this rule. So there it moved. He continued on with his putt. That's okay. If the player lifts or deliberately touches their ball at rest or causes it to move, the player is going to get 1 stroke. So this animation, the player is deliberately touching the ball to identify it. That's going to be the penalty of 1 stroke. They did not mark it, so they're still going to be on the hook for that penalty. We see our lovely exceptions here. The rules like to do this to us. There are going to be 5 exceptions under this rule. Many of them are obvious reasons players should not get penalties, but if the rule did not list them, how would you know they are not penalties? So exception 1, player is allowed to lift or move the ball. There's no penalty when the player lifts the ball or causes it to move under a rule that allows the ball to be lifted and then replaced on its original spot. Maybe requires a moved ball to be replaced on its original spot, or requires or allows the player to drop or place a ball again, or to play a ball from a different place. Exception 2, accidental movement. We already covered this one. Accidental movement in trying to find or identify the ball. There's no penalty when the player accidentally causes the ball to move while trying to find or identify it. Accidental movement on the putting green. We've hinted at this before, but there's no penalty when the player accidentally causes the ball to move on the putting green, no matter how it happens. Again, this is accidental movement, not just being careless. Accidental movement anywhere except on the putting green while applying a rule. There is no penalty when the player accidentally causes the ball to move anywhere except on the putting green while taking reasonable actions to mark the spot of the ball or lift or replace the ball when allowed to do so. Maybe to remove a movable obstruction, we're allowed to do that. Restore worsening conditions when allowed to do so. We talked about that back in Rule 8. Take relief under a rule. We're applying a rule again, so accidental movement is okay. Including in determining whether relief is available under a rule. Maybe if you're swinging your club to see if there's interference from a condition, you accidentally hit your golf ball. We're not going to be on the hook there for a penalty. or where to take relief, maybe you're trying to determine nearest point of complete relief. Finally, under this exception for measuring under a rule. So maybe if you're trying to decide order of play and match play, trying to see who's away, and you're measuring under this rule, accidental movement is okay. It looks like they are on the putting green, so I guess it would be if you're out on the out in the fairway and trying to measure for some reason. That's okay. Our fifth and final exception, a ball moves after coming to rest against the player or equipment. There's no penalty if after the player's ball comes to rest against the player or their equipment, as a result of a stroke or dropping the ball, the player causes the ball to move when they move or when they remove their equipment. So drop the ball, maybe it comes to rest up against their golf bag. Maybe part of their equipment. That's okay if they're causing the ball to move. Or here we see it hit the player's foot. So as long as we replace this, if it happens accidentally, if it happens deliberately, we're going to need to look at rules 11 and 14 and kind of figure out what we need to do. So penalty for playing a ball from a wrong place in breach of this rule, we're going to again get the general penalty. In most cases, I would say just get the ball back to where you moved it from, and you more than likely will be okay under the rules, right? Like you'll be okay. I'd say better that than get the general penalty, but that's just me. If a player is required to replace a moved ball under Rule 9.4 but fails to do so and plays from a wrong place, here we're going to see this lovely golf math. They're only going to get the general penalty. So in this case, this is our 1 + 2 = 2 rather than 1 + 2 = 3. So here's our fifth section of this rule, ball lifted or moved by opponent in match play. Again, opponents are only in match play. We do not see them in stroke play. An opponent is only somebody you see in match play. But this rule applies only when it is known or virtually certain that the opponent, maybe their caddy or maybe their partner or maybe their partner's caddy, so they're affiliates, lifted a player's ball at rest or their actions caused the ball to move. If the opponent plays the player's ball as a wrong ball, again, this is playing traffic cop. It's saying we need to go look in rule 6.3. We're not going to look in here because that's playing a wrong ball. That's not moving their golf ball in match play. That's making a stroke at a wrong ball. So when the lifted or moved ball must be replaced, this is that same question. Are we replacing? Is there a penalty that maybe we saw in that previous 9.4? So if the opponent lifts or moves the player's ball at rest, the ball must be replaced on its original spot. If we do not know exactly, we are going to estimate. Except when the opponent is conceding the next stroke, a hole, or the match. These are pretty common sense. If you're making a concession, they're not replacing their golf ball. But again, I think the rules just want to call it out because maybe you wouldn't know otherwise. Or when the opponent lifts or moves the ball at the player's request because the player intends to apply a rule to take relief or to replace the ball on a different spot. So here, their opponent or the player asks their opponent to identify their golf ball at their request. So that's okay under the rules. Our penalty for lifting or deliberately touching a ball or causing it to move. So if the opponent lifts or deliberately touches the player's ball at rest or causes it to move, the opponent is going to get 1 penalty stroke. So the opponent gets it, not the player, right? So whoever's taking that action is going to be the one who gets penalized. But there are several exceptions. We're going to see those three right here. So our first exception, opponent is allowed to lift the player's ball. There is no penalty when the opponent lifts the ball when conceding. We already saw this, but again, I think this is that repetition within the rules that are making sure that we understand this. So when conceding the next stroke, a hole, or the match to the player, or at the player's request. Exception 2, marking and lifting the player's ball on the putting green by mistake. There's no penalty when the opponent marks the spot of the player's ball and lifts it on the putting green in the mistaken belief that it is the opponent's own ball. So maybe we have that situation we were talking about back in Rule 7. They're hitting up to this elevated green. They don't know where either golf ball lands. They mark it, they lift it, and they see, oh my gosh, that's actually my opponent's golf ball. This exception is getting us off the hook. There's not going to be a penalty in this scenario. Exception 3, same exceptions as for the player. So there's not going to be a penalty when the opponent accidentally causes the ball to move while taking any of the actions covered in those exceptions we just covered in Rule 9.4b. It's nice of the rules to kind of cut down on some wording, make the book a little shorter. We'll just want to look back to these other 4 exceptions. So again, we see this same penalty statement. We are in match play. So again, the general penalty is just going to be loss of hole. All right, a next one that is kind of a fun one, I suppose. Ball lifted or moved by an outside influence. What is an outside influence? So any of these people or things that can affect what happens to a player's ball or equipment or to the course. So any person, including another player, except the player or their caddy or their partner or the opponent or any of their caddies. So maybe the partner's or opponent's caddy. I think this is a really good visual. It just outlines who are not outside influences. Another outside influence could be an animal, and any natural object or artificial object or anything else, including another ball in motion, except for natural forces. And we saw what natural forces were earlier. Again, wind, water, or when something happens for no apparent reason. Artificially propelled air, so maybe from a turf fan. These can also be outside influences. So getting back to the rule, if it is known or virtually certain that an outside influence, including another player in stroke play or another ball, lifted or moved the player's ball at rest, there is no penalty and the ball must be replaced on its original spot. So we can't just go around penalizing the dog or the iguana or the seagull. Like, what's the point in that, right? So there's not going to be a penalty. The player is not causing it to move. So we just want to, again, make sure we get it back on its original spot. This applies whether or not the player's ball has been found. So, you know, we see here that dog picks up the ball, runs away with it. Maybe we never find it. So we're just going to want to replace it with a different golf ball. If it is not known or virtually certain that the ball was lifted or moved by an outside influence and the ball is lost, the player must take stroke and distance relief. So this is kind of a bummer under this rule. That's why we want to make sure we're 95% sure that we know what happened. And maybe an outside influence caused the ball to move. Otherwise, it's just lost and we got to go back from where we last played from. If the player's ball is played as a wrong ball by another player, again, this is going to be covered in Rule 6, not in this rule. So, as I'm sure you guys have understood, if there is a penalty from playing a ball from a wrong place in breach of Rule 9.6, we're going to get the general penalty again. So ball marker lifted or moved. We're here in the home stretch of Rule 9. But this rule covers what to do if a ball marker that is marking the spot of a lifted ball is lifted or moved before the ball is replaced. So if it's known or virtually certain a player's ball marker is lifted or moved in any way before the ball is replaced, the player must either replace the ball on its original spot or place a ball marker to mark that original spot. So here we'll see a penalty for lifting a ball marker or causing it to move. So if the player or their opponent in match play lifts the player's ball marker or causes it to move, the player gets 1 penalty stroke. So it's basically that the ball marker is the ball, if you want to think about it like that in this particular part of the rule. So we want to, again, be careful to make sure that we're not moving it. So if there's, you're marking your ball in the fairway, you're going to want to treat it just as if the actual golf ball was there. We do have our exception. So here we'll see in all cases where the player or opponent gets no penalty for lifting the player's ball or accidentally causing it to move. There's also no penalty for lifting or accidentally moving the player's ball marker. So for example, accidentally moving it on the putting green, you put your ball marker down, you tap it down, it sticks to the sole of your putter. You've caused it to move accidentally. You're going to want to put the ball marker back where it was. There's not going to be a penalty. This calls out our different exceptions. Again, we learn about the player exceptions. We learn about the opponent exceptions, which then also reference the player exceptions. So penalty for playing a ball from a wrong place in breach of Rule 9.7, we're going to get the general penalty. But again, this general penalty is falling under Rule 14.7. So here's our Rule 9 recap. A ball has moved if it leaves its original spot. This is, again, we're living in our rules of golf world, where if it oscillates or wobbles, never leaves its original spot, it hasn't moved. If it has been moved by natural forces, we're going to play it from the new spot, generally speaking. The player, their caddy, partner, partner's caddy, we're going to replace it. If it's moved by the opponent, we're going to replace it. If it's moved by an outside influence, we're going to replace it. And in all of these scenarios where we are replacing the golf ball and we don't 100% know where it was, we're just going to use our best judgment to get the ball back to where we think it came to rest. But is there a penalty? Natural forces, we're not going to get a penalty. The player, yes, generally speaking, again, we like to talk in these general terms when we're trying to remember if there is a penalty. The opponent, generally, yes, we're going to get a penalty. Outside influence, no. And so with that, I don't see any questions, but want to thank you all again for joining us tonight. We are just a minute shy of 6 o'clock. I did want to also make a brief plug. We do have 2 in-person Rules of Golf seminars coming up. One on Thursday the 13th at March 13th at Winners Run. And we also have one on Wednesday, March 19th at Chartwell. So if you are able to get to those, there's information on our website about that. They start at 10 and run until around 1 o'clock, but there is lunch included in that. So would be great to see some faces at those 2 Rules of Golf seminars. And I will send an email out to everybody with some other links to important pages on the USGA website and also the recording of this in case you want to go back and look through something. But next week we have rules 10 and 11 coming up. That will be our last virtual rule session for the season. We will start to get into posting season, which is fun. Hopefully this rain goes away and we can enjoy the rest of the season, the upcoming season. So again, thank you for joining us this evening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.